So if you don't have a lot of time to paint, you're a bit intimidated by a larger sheet of paper, this tutorial will be perfect for you. Let's get started. So I'm going to start off now mixing some sky colours. So this is phthalo blue. I'm going to wet the sky area with my size 8 round mop brush. Just down to those hills, down to the horizon, painting wet into wet there, adding a touch more blue and painting this a little bit more damp into wet to make it darker at the top of the sky, and just working my way down, rinsing my brush, just diluting that paint, and as I go towards the horizon the colour will get lighter, so it'll look a little bit further away, and also the clouds get smaller, as you can see there. And it just creates the illusion of depth. So I'm mixing up here some yellow ochre, and I'm going to paint that sort of in the foreground and middle ground, wet on dry, adding a touch of quinacridone gold and painting that wet on dry right at the bottom, adding a pinch of Indian red, which is quite creamy, damp into wet, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to run naturally there. I am mixing up a little bit of ultramarine with a pinch of alizarin crimson, and I'm painting the sort of distant hills there, and I'm going to sprinkle some salt onto the damp painting, mixing up a little bit of ultramarine and the Indian red, and I'm just going to paint a little bit more onto that distant hill there just to make it a little bit darker, damp into damp with my size 4 round brush. And I'm just going to paint sort of a kind of a stormy sky, wet into wet there, leaving some gaps for the clouds. Keep it really simple. I'm now mixing up some more ultramarine and just painting that at the top just to make it a little bit darker and a little bit cooler and a bit more stormier as well, dropping in a little bit more ultramarine wet into wet with the size 8 brush. Getting a pinch of the alizarin crimson and a touch of the yellow ochre, so it's a lovely natural looking colour. And I'm painting that wet on dry, getting a touch of the quinacridone gold, pushing that into that colour, wet into wet. This is all from my imagination. Mixing up some sap green there with the ultramarine and burnt sienna and painting that wet into wet there in the foreground. Mixing up some undersea green, and I'm just painting that wet into wet, a little bit more of the sap green mixed with the ultramarine, so it's quite creamy, and just painting some distant trees there, wet into wet, and a little bit of that darker green in the foreground. I've mixed up here the ultramarine with a little bit more of the sap green and a pinch of the Jane's grey, and I'm painting this sort of damp into wet with my size 4 round brush. I'm just mixing up some more ultramarine, slightly creamier, and painting it damp into damp there with the size 8 brush. Bigger marks, stronger colour, so it looks nearer to us, and adding a little bit that in the middle of the sky, damp into wet there. Adding a touch more of the ultramarine mixed with quinacridone gold in the foreground, and now using my plastic card not only to scratch into the wet surface there, but also to lift off the paint as well, which is what I'm doing here. Make sure the paint is damp and not too wet, otherwise it won't work so well. And remember, if you scratch into the surface, it is permanent. So I'm sprinkling some more salt there, and what that will do, it'll absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures later. Wet the paper right down to the bottom using the size 8 brush. I've actually got a very tiny little bit of buff titanium there, very watered down. You could use a very watered down raw sienna. This is a little bit of Hansa yellow light mixed with the buff titanium. You could use this on its own. Touch of the quinacridone gold now, all wet into wet, and a little bit of burnt sienna right at the top. I'm painting Indian red damp into damp at the top there, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to blend into the colours below. Using a touch more of that Indian red damp into wet, using the tip of my brush to create a kind of a horizon line there. Using the size 4 brush to add some more of the Indian red damp into damp in the sky to create some more clouds. I've mixed up some grey with the Indian red there, painting a little bit more damp into damp at the top there just to create some darker clouds and to create depth. Just using a little bit of burnt sienna now, wet into wet for the more distant clouds. Mixing up here ultramarine mixed with some burnt sienna and a pinch of grey. And I'm painting sort of damp into damp here, the foreground. The colour wasn't quite dark enough, so I'm using some of the phthalo blue mixed with a little bit of that Indian red. It makes a really much stronger colour. I want it to come forward. So I've added a pinch of the burnt sienna as well to warm things up. And here's a close-up. This is all damp into wet really, and I'm sort of painting grasses and they almost look like little wildflowers there. So just painting sort of distant land here as well. They could be trees, and it's all kind of wet into wet here. Using my plastic card to sort of pull up some of that wet paint to create some thinner foliage there in the foreground. Mixing up a darker green here using the Undersea green with some Ultramarine, and just painting pretty much wet on dry now in this middle painting using my size 4 round brush. Excuse the back of my hand there. This creates darker grasses and pulls that foreground forward. And doing the same on this left hand painting here, a few little darks and details, pretty much wet on dry here along the horizon and in the foreground with my size 4 brush. I think it's a good time now to allow the paintings to dry naturally. As you can see there, the salts work quite nicely in places. I'm just painting wet on dry there using ultramarine burnt sienna and softening it with a clean damp brush just to soften it, to push it back a little bit. Create some interest but not too much that comes forward and makes the painting look flat. And just adding a few little darks and details here in the foreground to sort of bring that forward to make it look more 3D. And little marks like this can make such a difference. A few more little brush strokes here and there in the foreground of the centre painting, a few more darks along the horizon just to add a little bit of information. It can be quite abstract. And I'm just wetting the sky here with a very dilute raw sienna. I'm just adding a little pinch of ultramarine here mixed with a small pinch of burnt sienna, wet into wet. So just a third from the top there. Mixing up a little bit of Cobalt turquoise. You could use Cerulean, and I will give you colour alternatives in the description below. So just adding a little bit more of the ultramarine there with a pinch of Jane's grey, and just sort of tickling some paint there on the horizon. I'm using a size 8 round brush. A little bit more ultramarine here, and just painting this wet into wet. And it's kind of to create the impression of distant trees. So it's all wet into wet. I've added a little bit of phthalo green. You could use Viridian. And I'm adding a pinch of red to kind of neutralise it. So I've mixed them both together there. And just painting that wet into wet, and it almost looks like reflections now as well. So I'm just going with the flow. So I'm tilting now to allow the paint to kind of sort of spread upwards there. So just using the plastic card to draw the paint out to create thin lines, maybe sort of branches or tree trunks, and I'm also sort of reflecting those directly below using a plastic card. I am mixing up here a little bit more of the phthalo green with a little bit of ultramarine and a pinch of the red. So it's quite a dark neutral colour. You could use Paynes grey on its own if you wanted to. I just love mixing different colours together. So I'm painting this more damp into wet using my size 4 round brush. It's quite a lovely neutral colour. I've made it slightly thicker. That's the green, the blue, pinch of red, and just painting damp into damp here. And I'm just using the tip of the brush to stipple damp into damp to create the look of wildflowers, adding some dark here on the horizon just above the waterline, damp into damp with the size 4 brush. I've taken off the excess paint and I'm using the belly of the brush, and the paper here is quite dry, and I'm sort of scrubbing the belly of the brush to create this texture. I call it side brush, dry brush. You may need to practice this, but it's a really nice way of creating foliage or texture. And now what I'm doing is I'm just painting with a Jane's grey, but you could use a Paynes grey, some of the branches and tree trunks here to sort of connect them to that foliage, and it kind of brings the trees to life. So just from my imagination now, I've got sort of trees, a lot of water, some foreground here, reflections, a pale sky, and I'm just adding a few more darks there just at the water's edge, Again, taking the excess paint off, I'm just going to sort of paint some reflections of those trees there, damp into damp, just a few little sort of horizontal marks there, creating a bit of movement as well. I'm painting some vertical marks as well to create the reflections of the tree trunks. And this is all damp into damp. You could wait till the painting is dry to do that. Just lifting off some of the paint here in the foreground with my plastic card. And I'm again stippling here just to create some more textures, damp into damp, literally with quite a creamy grey and a few more darker grasses, damp into damp. You could paint this wet on dry once the painting is dry if you feel more comfortable to do so. So a bit of a stormy sky, so I'm painting this wet into wet with my size 8 brush, adding a slightly stronger colour here, less water, more paint, and I'm allowing that to run down, so I've got my painting on a tilt, so to create a lovely atmospheric stormy sky. And I'm just painting some of that colour wet on dry at the edge of that waterway there, and I'm just blending now with a clean damp brush, keeping the marks horizontal as well for the water, adding a little bit more dark at the water's edge and letting it run down. I did add a pinch of cerulean to some of the colour in the water. Mixing up some of the Hansa yellow light with a little bit of the sap green, just a pinch, painting wet on dry the foreground and middle ground there with the size 8 brush. Mixing in a touch of that cobalt turquoise, more Hansa yellow lights. I've got a lovely limey green, painting that wet into those two fields. And I'm just lifting off some of the paint in the water. I felt I'd lost the light a little. So don't be afraid to use your paper towel if you need to. I've mixed up here some Cerulean green with a pinch of the yellow, painting that sort of more damp into damp on the horizon there for the distant trees. Added a little bit more phthalo blue there just to make that a little bit darker. Adding some of that dark now to the edge of the water here, damp into damp, just to create some detail, leading the eye into the painting, and then softening with a clean damp brush using that sort of green. And you could mix up some ultramarine and quinacridone gold to create a variety of different greens. Experiment. This is your opportunity to do so. You don't have to divide your paper up like this. You could use your sketchbooks, remember. I'm just adding a few more grasses here and there. A little bit more dark here on the horizon, using that lovely dark green, the phthalo green with some of the perhaps quinacridone gold. A few more grasses, damp into damp, still using that size 4 brush. So building up the detail in the foreground, creating depth in the painting, adding a few more sort of marks in the sort of middle ground field as well. So I'm using a clean, damp paper towel to lift off some clouds. So make sure you wring all the water out. And I just find using a damp paper towel just a little bit better. It doesn't leave sort of hard, awkward edges, and it creates a more of a natural looking effect. So I'm just lifting off to create some sort of low cloud there. And I'm just adding a few darks here, reflections in the water, pretty much wet on dry using the Jane's Grey. A few more darker grasses using that Jane's Grey with a pinch of quinacridone gold. You could use yellow, and a few more smaller grasses. As marks get further away, they get smaller, and that creates depth in the painting. You're creating an illusion here. A little bit more dark on the water's edge, and that's really to divide the water from the land, to create the illusion of water, giving that contrast, and again adding a little bit more dark on the horizon. I'm using my plastic card to lift off the damp paint there to create lighter grasses. So again, big ones in the foreground, and they get smaller as they go away there, but it's a nice way of creating detail. So I'm just lifting off in the distance here to create sort of lighter tree trunks, hopefully, and adding a little bit more dark along that water's edge. The great thing about watercolour, it does lift off. So I'm lifting off here with a clean, damp brush. Some of that dark spilled over onto the light grasses. And I'm using the side brush, dry brush again to create some foliage there. Remember, take the excess paint off in your paper towel and use the belly of the brush and scrub on that textured paper. And it will give the illusion of foliage there. And I really like that technique. And I'm just stippling in the foreground here to create some more details, pretty much wet on dry, using my size 4 brush. So again, wetting the sky with the size 8 brush, just with clean water down over the mountains to avoid any hard edges. I'm mixing up some cerulean and I'm painting wet into wet there, leaving some gaps for clouds. And as the sky goes towards the horizon, I'll pale it. So I'm just making it a touch darker at the top there by adding cerulean mixed with phthalo blue, damp into wet. And again, scrunching up a damp, clean piece of paper towel, lifting off some clouds there, trying to create a variety of effects there. Do practice this. It's such a fun technique, especially if you're a beginner starting out in watercolour. It's very effective for painting clouds, creating clouds. So I'm using that cerulean mixed with the phthalo blue, painting wet on dry, just sort of water sort of in that foreground, and then swiping through some of that Hansa yellow light, a little bit of the sap green, Undersea green and Quinacridone gold. What I like about using pans sometimes, you can just dip your brush into any sort of colour you fancy. So I'm just lifting off there a little bit just to control that sort of run. It ran a little bit too much into the water. So again, mixing up phthalo blue with ultramarine. I've got a pinch of yellow in there as well. And I'm just painting wet on dry, some distant fields. And I've swiped in some of that quinacridone gold, couldn't resist. Mixing up a little bit of the Undersea green with some Hansa yellow light there, painting that damp into wet. And what happens there, the paint doesn't run as much, you have more control. I've mixed up Cerulean green with a phthalo blue. You get a glorious dark, rich green, painting that damp into damp in the foreground and in the middle ground. I've mixed up a very dilute cerulean here and I'm just painting the mountains, pretty much wet on dry. And now I'm mixing up some ultramarine with a little bit of the Jane's Grey and painting this damp into damp. A touch more ultramarine, little bit of Venetian red, and I'm just painting the sort of mountain nearest to us damp into damp there to bring that forward so the distant mountain looks a lot paler and it creates depth. And I'm actually adding some salt there onto the damp surface, and that should absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures. Mixing up some more of the ultramarine with the Venetian red, so I've got a lovely strong colour, and I'm painting this nearest mountain damp into damp just to make it darker and bring it forward. Using the plastic card now and lifting off some of the damp paint in the foreground there to create lighter grasses and textures. Mixing up some of the phthalo blue with the Jane's Grey, so a lovely dark colour, and painting this damp into damp in the foreground. And then sort of lifting up that dark paint to create really thin marks with the plastic card. It's really effective. Look at that, it really creates depth as well. A little bit more dark now on the painting on the left just to give it a little bit more detail. It's pretty much wet on dry, and I'm adding cerulean, a little bit of phthalo blue, Venetian red, burnt sienna, anything goes. And I'm just using the paper towel to protect the rest of the painting. I'm just spattering there to create details and textures in the foreground, and spattering the centre painting as well there, wet on dry, and adding a few more darks and details there with the phthalo blue and Paynes grey, or Jane's Grey rather, on the foreground and on the water's edge, wet on dry. A few more dark grasses here, lots and lots of detail in the foreground, again to create depth in the painting. And just using the side brush, dry brush again to create some lovely foliage there on the horizon. Mixing up some of the phthalo blue here with the Jane's Grey, and I'm going to paint wet on dry now this nearest mountain. I felt it was sort of not coming forward enough, and I really want to bring that forward using my size 4 round brush. I felt it was a little bit dark, so I'm just lifting off slightly just to push it back a bit. It was coming forward too much. And just adding a little bit of the Hansa yellow light with the Cobalt turquoise just underneath there, just to kind of give that sort of distant feel, a little bit more colour and add a little bit more depth to it. And just sort of finessing the distant hills here using a very dilute Cerulean and Jane's Grey. Mixing up some of the Phthalo blue with the Jane's Grey, adding some very thin grasses, wet on dry in the foreground, and a few little details there on the water's edge there, just to kind of add some more details. And again, stippling. I just love stippling, but of course you can spatter as well if you want to, but it's just to add some details, especially in the foreground. So I'm painting wet on dry. I've rinsed my brush, I've just diluted that cerulean and just sort of wetting the sort of middle and bottom part of the sky and just blending that cerulean down so it gets paler as it goes towards the horizon and it creates depth. Adding some more cerulean, a little bit stronger at the top, wet in wet. Adding a little bit of cerulean with a pinch of burnt umber so it just greys it down a little. And I'm painting wet on dry with the size 8 brush. You can see I'm just using the tip of the brush there and painting sort of sideways as well to create horizontal lines or marks there for the sea. Rinsing my brush and just softening and blending with a clean damp brush to pale that colour. Mixing up a little bit of raw sienna and yellow ochre. You can just use one or the other with a pinch of the cerulean. So it just takes the edge off the yellow and I'm just blending there into the sea. And it's to create some reflections from the jetty, mixing up some buff titanium and just dropping that in wet into wet, just to make that slightly stronger. Painting the sand area here, or the beach, wet on dry, still using that brush, and I'll pretty much stick to that brush. If I need to paint very small details, I'll swap to a smaller brush. A little bit more burnt umber here and just painting that in the foreground, wet into wet, to build up the tonal value as well, and that makes it look closer to us, thus creating depth. Mixing up some burnt sienna with some Jane's Grey, painting damp into damp for some reflection there. And when you paint damp into damp, the paint doesn't run as much, so you get these soft edges. So a little bit more sort of creamier paint now, less water, more pigment, and I'm painting pretty much damp into damp with the tip of my brush, and this is to represent little sort of rocks and stones on the beach, and I'll be using my plastic card to swipe just before the sheen sort of disappears from the surface, and I'm sprinkling some salt onto the damp sort of surface there where the beach, the sandy beach is. And I'm now swiping with a plastic card cut up, and as you can see, the paint doesn't run back in on itself. If it does, just wait a little bit longer, it's too wet. And it's a really good sort of technique to practice as well, and it's very effective, so it creates lights and mid-tones and darks as well. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I'm just now using my size 4 round brush, and I've used some of the burnt sienna with the Jane's Grey and just sort of painting some details. And these are kind of like houses there, windows, rooftops, and some distant sort of buildings as well there. Pretty much wet on dry. So mixing up here a little bit of ultramarine and burnt sienna and just painting a few little darks there just to build up that detail there. So really simplifying the distance there and just sort of adding a few little marks and poles, etc., just to add more interest and using a little bit of artistic license as well. So just softening and blending just underneath there to create some reflections using that dark colour, wet on dry with a clean damp brush. So mixing up some more ultramarine with the burnt sienna, you can use some of the grey, and I'm just going to paint this area or a sea wall here, and it really anchors the little painting as well. It's almost the star of the show with the buildings in the distance. So I'm using lovely warm colours, painting this wet on dry. Adding a little bit of Venetian red there as well, just to add a bit of oomph, of warmth, of colour. A little bit more of the burnt sienna mixed with the grey, and just working my way down to the bottom there, sort of blending with my size 4 brush. And just sort of finessing there. I'm bringing the wall slightly out to an angle there on the edge, adding a few more darks and details to the houses there, using the tip of my brush. You could just use Paynes grey, and just adding a little bit of dark just at the bottom of the seawall, and painting pretty much wet on dry some reflections of that seawall in the water there. Mixing up some of the raw sienna, burnt sienna and grey, and just painting some marks there on the shoreline, wet on dry, and just blending with a clean damp brush. Just adding some darks here in between the rocks just to build up some shadows there, using the Jane's grey, wet on dry. And then just adding a few little darks and details here and there, using the tip of my brush with the grey on its own, or you could add a pinch of the burnt sienna as well. You saw there I added a few reflections in the water. You could use cerulean with a pinch of burnt sienna for the water. So I'm just mixing up some of the burnt sienna. You can use a little bit of ultramarine or the grey, and I'm sort of protecting my sort of other paintings with my hand, and I'm spattering there just to create details and texture. As you saw, they got a little spot in the sky, so I'm just using some more of that dark to paint some birds. So it was quite fortuitous really, and I think it adds life to a little painting as well. So I've got a large, medium and small, so they kind of look like they're flying away, just adding a little bit more dark here and there using the grey. I'm just swiping at the bottom of the seawall here to create light and texture using my plastic card. So I'm starting off again with the sky, wetting it with clean water, and then using my size 4 brush with some cerulean, I'm painting wet into wet and blending there with a clean damp brush. So I'm adding a little bit more blue here and there, wet into wet. I love that colour blue. So I'm mixing up a little bit of Pyrrole red with the cerulean to make a sort of grey cloud colour, and I'm painting this wet in wet with my size 4 brush, so it's quite a warm cloud there. Adding a pinch more cerulean just to make it slightly darker, especially at the top, but the clouds get smaller as they go towards the horizon, and of course paler as well. So just adding some more cerulean towards the horizon there, and again blending with a clean damp brush. Just working my way down, paling that sky as it goes towards the horizon there. I'm mixing up a little bit of Phthalo blue and Quinacridone rose. So it's quite a dark colour here. And I've just added a little bit more red, the Pyrrole red there. You could use a bit of burnt sienna. So it's just to make a really lovely sort of dark silhouetted foreground, painting this wet on dry, dropping a little bit more of the Phthalo blue. You could use Prussian blue. And this really sort of makes your foreground and brings it forward. So just using my little size 4 brush there and just creating some little texture on the edge there. And this is wet into wet, but sort of pushing that up into the dry sort of area above. So mixing up some more of the Phthalo blue with a little bit of the burnt sienna. You can use lots of different dark colours to create some variety there. And I'm just dropping that in wet. I'm painting some raw sienna here with a little bit of the grey in just to take the edge off so it's not too bright. Wet on dry for the distance. And adding a little bit of burnt sienna just at the bottom there, damp into wet. Mixing up some of the grey there and just dropping that in wet into wet there just to create some darks at the bottom. I've decided to change the shape here, so adding a little bit more grey mixed with a little bit of that Phthalo blue, wet into wet there in the foreground. So mixing up some more of that Phthalo blue with a little bit of burnt sienna, and I am painting the water wet on dry Also adding a little bit of phthalo green to give it that lovely sea green colour. And I am going to sort of blend that into that blue wash there, and leaving a little bit of a gap between the land and the water so it doesn't run, and a little bit more of the green and the phthalo blue. This is a very dilute phthalo blue, so I'm just coming down to the land there, leaving a gap so it doesn't bleed into one another there, and just dropping a little bit of darker colour here using ultramarine and the phthalo blue, and just sort of painting right up to the land now, just so I don't have too many white gaps. And I'm diluting the water to make it paler at the bottom, and sprinkling some salt on to the foreground there, and that'll absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures. I've decided to lift off some of the paint there in the water area just to create some more light. I'm using some brush show, and I'm going to sprinkle that onto the foreground there to create some more darks and textures as well. If you don't have brush show, you could spatter when it's dry, or use a watercolour pencil and sandpaper. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to give the salt a chance to work. Meanwhile, I am going to paint the trees. I'm using my size 4 brush, and I've mixed up some ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm painting wet on dry. So I'm just painting here in the foreground a few little grasses, etc., wet on dry, using my size 4 round brush. I'm also sort of scrubbing there to create the brush on the trees there, so it creates the look of much smaller branches and twigs. I'm just painting the sort of branches to the left here, just adding a few more sort of darks here in the foreground, using my size 4 brush, creating extra grasses and foliage, and it really pulls that foreground away from the water, away from the distance, and it creates the illusion of depth. So for a bit of artistic license, I thought I'd put fence post in there as well. I'm going to finish off painting a little white sail, wet on dry, using white gouache with my size 4 round brush. I'm also going to paint in a reflection there as well, and just make that little sail just a little bit taller and blend that reflection there, and just add a few little highlights along the water's edge, wet on dry, and a few highlights in the water to finish off. For my next mini painting, I'm going to do a sunset seascape with a sort of a seashore and some buildings. And it is from my imagination, and I'm using yellows, oranges, reds, ultramarine here. And I'm just going to wet the sky with my size 8 mop brush down to the horizon, and also wet the sea area. So I'm painting yellow on the horizon, wet into wet, adding a little bit of the Pyrrole red mixed with the yellow to make orange, and painting it in the sea as well, wet into wet. So painting a little bit of the Pyrrole red now, wet into wet there on the horizon part of the sky, and also in the reflection there, right down to the bottom of the painting, a little bit more of that red along the shoreline there. I've added a little bit more yellow here, painting that wet into wet. So I really want these lovely kind of warm colours here in the sky for the sunset. Mixing up some ultramarine now just at the top of the sky, a little bit of blue sky there, and blending it into the orange and the red. I've mixed up some cerulean there. I'm painting that damp into wet at the top. I'm using my paper towel now to lift out the sun, and also lift out the reflection of the sun there by swiping down. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some Cobalt turquoise, and I'm just painting that on the right side of the sea there. It's quite a light colour, and the left side wet into wet. I've also added phthalo blue and ultramarine, painting that wet into wet on the left and on the right hand side. I've mixed up some ultramarine with burnt sienna, quite creamy, and painting damp into damp there, just along the shoreline there, to really sort of create a dark against light, to make the water, the sea water, look and create the illusion of water. And I'm just using horizontal marks, painting damp into damp over the top of that blue there. to create some darker reflections. A little bit more ultramarine now on the sort of shore there, because it's sort of the sun's going down, it's a little bit darker. Mixed up some ultramarine here with some burnt sienna, painting pretty much wet on dry, but at the top part of that, the sky is still damp, so you get a lovely soft fuzzy edge. I'm just lifting out some clouds here as well, using the paper towel on the horizon, and just adding a little bit more burnt sienna here and there, blending with my size 8 brush. Adding a little bit more of that burnt sienna mixed with a pinch of ultramarine in the water, painting damp into damp just to create some darker reflections and ripples. And just adding a little bit of dark on the horizon there, some distant land perhaps. It's really nice to work from your imagination. You can just add bits as you go. You don't have the pressure of copying a photograph. So just adding a few little darks, damp into damp here and there, using the ultramarine and burnt sienna. And just building up now, adding a few darks and details here with the burnt sienna mixed with a pinch of the ultramarine, so it makes a lovely dark brown. You could use burnt umber as an alternative colour. I'm just swiping now with my plastic card just to create some almost semi-abstract details. It could be anything really, houses in the distance, etc. I'm also swiping the water, just lifting off to create some lighter ripples just here and there, and also some movement. When you're painting small, try to restrict yourself just to a few marks here and there. One thing I find is that it sort of stops you from overworking, and it gives you more time because you're painting so small. So I really encourage you to have a go at painting a sunset on a small scale. It doesn't have to be this picture. You can just pick out a photograph and just work through some of the stages. I'm just using my small size 4 brush now just to add a few little details, and I've actually painted a little bit around the sun just to kind of bring it out a little bit more there, painting damp into damp using the size 4 brush. After all, the sun is the star of the show, so I'm just sort of adding a few more ripples in the water, damp into damp there. I've mixed up more ultramarine here, quite creamy, with the burnt sienna, and I'm just adding sort of telegraph poles, etc., just along the horizon line, just to add some detail so it looks like a little town. It could be St Ives or somewhere like that. And just adding a few more darks and details, damp into damp, along the shoreline there, using my size 4 brush, and a few more in the water as well, and along the horizon line. And I'm just using some white gouache with my size 4 brush. It's straight from the tube, and I'm just adding a little bit of white in the water. You can do this wet on dry or damp into damp just to finish off the painting. I'm going to paint the sky, so I've wet it with clean water. And I've mixed up some very dilute Pyrrole red. I'm painting that wet into wet. Little bit of raw sienna there, wet into wet. And just blending with a clean damp brush. Getting a pinch of ultramarine there and painting that wet into wet, blending it into the red paint there, and just sort of painting at the top there. I want quite an atmospheric, interesting sky. Mixed up a little bit of ultramarine, quite dark there, with a pinch of burnt sienna, just to darken up that sky around the sides and at the top there, coming from the top right hand side. Painting some of the Hansa yellow deep, damp into wet. When it's damp, it doesn't travel so far, and I want it to be kind of like not quite a sunset, but a lovely glow in the sky there. Mixing up some of the phthalo blue, really quite creamy, with the ultramarine and the burnt sienna, so it just takes the edge off that phthalo blue. And I'm painting wet on dry. I just added a pinch of Quinacridone burnt orange. You can carry on using the burnt sienna or burnt umber to that colour. Little bit of raw sienna and the Hansa yellow deep. Just use cadmium yellow and raw sienna. So it's just a lighter colour there, and I'm pushing that into that darker colour. Just want to create some interest here on these mountains. Just adding a little bit more of that burnt orange, working my way down there. Pretty much wet on dry, but dropping colours wet into wet. Just going to fill in here with a clean damp brush. It was coming forward too much. I missed a bit. It was a dry spot. A little bit more of that phthalo blue, burnt sienna and ultramarine here on the left hand side, wet on dry. Using my size 8 brush, I've just gone a little bit darker there. You could use a little bit of Paynes grey or just thicker ultramarine with burnt sienna. So just painting some darks around the edge because I really want that waterfall to stand out. So just adding a little bit of the turquoise here with a pinch of the yellow, painting wet on dry. Just adding a little bit more water there just to dilute that colour, a little bit more of that Hansa yellow deep, painting it wet into wet, just creating these beautiful colours, mixing them on the paper. Treat these little mini paintings like experiments. It just really builds up your confidence in watercolour, but also sort of gives you an opportunity to try out different ideas as well without the pressure of painting a larger painting. So just adding a few more darks here, dropping in some cerulean as well. I've swapped to my size 4 brush and I'm just sort of painting some darks there at the top, damp into damp, with a mixture of the ultramarine with a pinch of the burnt sienna. A little bit of damp and damp here and there to create some more marks. I'm dropping in some water, so I'm experimenting again to create some backgrounds, and also dropped in a little bit of yellow there as well. And just sort of blending at the bottom here, using a little bit more dark. You can use a little bit of Paynes grey and just sort of finessing the edges there with my size 4 brush, adding a little bit of dark at the top, left and right there to really separate it from the sky. I'm just using a clean sort of wet brush, just catching the edges there that haven't dried, just to soften them, but also allow the paint to flow into the centre there, using the colour of the sort of rocks and grasses, doing the same as I go down towards the bottom, and then adding a little bit of dilute ultramarine there, as you can see, with a pinch of the burnt sienna. This is wet on dry here, getting a little bit of water and then just diluting and blending that there using the size 4 brush. I want to make sure I keep lots of light as well for the waterfall. Adding a little bit of dark there on the left and on the right hand side, using abstract marks as well here. Thought it'd be fun to experiment using the darks. So when you have dark paint, you want to use a dark colour like a grey or a sort of a dark blue mixed with a brown, and also make sure you don't put too much water in it, don't dilute it, and that's where you get your darks from. So just sort of finessing the edges of the waterfall there, and adding a little bit of burnt sienna mixed with ultramarine, just sort of separating the waterfall here. There's a rock there in the centre, so just building that up there with my size 4 brush. So I'm just going to finish off by using white gouache. You can do this wet on dry, but my painting is still damp. So this is white gouache straight from the tube, and I'm using lots of sort of abstracted sort of marks here, creating some highlights and interest, and just playing really and having fun. So just working around the painting there and finishing off with a spatter of the white paint. So I've slightly watered that down to finish. So again, wetting the sky with my size 8 brush. Mixing up a little bit of Quinacridone rose with ultramarine, about 50-50, and I'm painting the sky wet into wet. Add a pinch more ultramarine and mix that on the paper to make a little bit more of a blue violet colour, and I've added some alizarin crimson there as well to the left, and a little touch of ultramarine there, painting that, sort of blending that wet into wet with my size 8 brush. The paint ran a little bit here, so I'm just mopping with a clean damp brush. So I'm using some Pyrrole red, painting wet on dry here, just right in the middle. Add a little bit of that Hansa yellow deep as well, so I've got really sort of bright strong colours, and the sky is still running down, as you can see there, but I'm not going to let that bother me. I'm having fun and I'm experimenting. A little bit more of the red, the alizarin, sort of really lovely gorgeous colours there. Adding a touch of the ultramarine at the bottom there, painting damp into damp there, mixing up a little bit more of the ultramarine, the red or the crimson, and just sort of painting a little bit of dark at the bottom and pushing it into that red at the top. I am doing this for my imagination, so I'm just playing and experimenting, pushing a little bit more orange and red in there, and adding a touch of the Hansa yellow light here and painting that on the right hand side and pushing it into the damp paint. And these pans are lovely because they're by Daniel Smith and they're semi-moist and they really do give you so much paint here. So I'm pushing that paint into that yellow there, using a little bit of sap green here mixed with the yellow, so it's a lovely limey green, and pushing that at the bottom there, damp into damp, to create some lovely green. I'm adding some of that limey green at the top there for sort of distant fields, sort of damp into damp with my size 8 brush, both left and right. And I'm also pushing that colour into the red paint as well. Mixing up a little bit more Ultra into that sap green and painting damp into damp just to create some darks there. It looked a bit muddy and I wanted to be very sort of direct with my darks here. So painting that left and right, damp into damp. Sprinkling some table salt onto the damp paint there, and that will absorb the paint to create lovely light textures. I'm using the plastic card to sort of lift off some of that dark paint, running it through the light paint to create the look of tree trunks and branches there. And also in the foreground to lift off some of that dark paint to create sort of branches and twigs. Using a little bit of grey here, painting wet into wet on the horizon. It's drizzling up and down there to create some lovely natural looking textures. And I've mixed up the red and the alizarin, lovely creamy colour, and I'm spattering it with my size 4 brush in the horizon and middle ground there. As you can see, I've got a little bit in the sky, so I'm using a clean damp brush to blend that. And it didn't look quite good, so I'm using Ultramarine just to paint that damp into damp with my size 4 brush, adding a few darker clouds. So I'm just going with the flow. When things happen, you kind of have to make a few adjustments. So mixing up burnt sienna here with the Ultramarine just to make a darker colour, sort of on the left and the right there. Adding a few darks and details along the tree line there. And I'm just spattering sort of a little bit more of that red and crimson here and there, a little bit of yellow, and I'm mixing up a limey green here, lots of yellow, and just finishing off with a spatter there in the foreground and using my hand to protect not just that painting but the rest of the other paintings. A little bit more yellow here just along the horizon line to add a little bit of light to draw the eye into the painting, almost like a bit of a focal point there, just using the light. What I'm doing now is I'm wetting the sky just with very dilute raw sienna with my size 8 brush. And I've just added a little bit of buff titanium. You can carry on with the raw sienna, and dropped in some burnt umber mixed with ultramarine there, just swishing that in wet into wet with the size 8 brush, leaving lots of that sort of raw sienna and buff titanium coming through as well. I'm using a sort of scrunched up paper towel and I'm just lifting out some clouds. It's a really nice technique for creating clouds in watercolour just by lifting off the paint. And as you can see, it's lifted off nicely. I'm mixing up some more ultramarine there using my size 2 round brush. It's got a pinch of burnt umber, so it's a blue-grey, and I'm painting damp into damp. I've just cleaned my brush, taken the excess water off, and I'm just sort of softening and blending with a clean, damp brush, just so you don't get any hard edges. What I'm doing now is I've rinsed my brush again and I'm just sort of softening that cloud and just having a play really. And this is a great opportunity to experiment and play in watercolour. I'm using a clean damp brush. It's almost soaking up the paint there just to shape the cloud. So instead of lifting off with a paper towel, you can actually lift off with a clean damp brush. I'm actually mixing up some cerulean and I'm going to add a little bit of buff titanium to the cerulean, and it kind of neutralises it, and I love buff titanium. So I'm painting wet on dry the water using my size 8 brush, and I'm just sort of diluting as it goes towards the bottom. So I've just rinsed the brush and taken the excess paint off. I wanted to change the colour, and I'm just using cerulean on its own, wet into wet at the bottom part of the water. So I'm just sort of blending that there, adding some more of the ultramarine mixed with the burnt umber and painting damp into damp to create sort of markings in the water to show ripples, etc. So mixing up a little bit more, actually there's a bit of red there with the Cerulean and Ultramarine, and painting damp into damp now with the size 8 brush, just more sort of ripples in the water, bigger in the foreground, smaller in the distance. And this is to create depth in my painting. Again, I'm going to use the brush to lift off the paint. So as you saw there, I've taken the excess water off on the paper towel to allow the brush to behave like a sponge almost and soak up some of that paint to create lighter markings in the water, little highlights here and there. You may want to keep rinsing your brush, taking the excess paint off on the paper towel to continue doing that. Otherwise your brush will get a little bit contaminated. So I'm adding a little bit more dark, damp into damp here. You can use the Cerulean mixed with red or Ultramarine mixed with the burnt umber, and just painting that damp into damp with the size 8 brush. Mixed up a slightly darker colour here, using some of the Cerulean, Ultramarine, maybe a pinch of the burnt umber, and painting damp into damp, some distant buildings or trees even, and sort of just varying the sort of shapes as well. And I'm just painting damp into damp with my smaller size 2 brush, a little bit of burnt umber, really creamy. You can add a pinch of ultramarine to that as well. And I'm just sort of drawing with the brush some of these markers. It could be a crane or something like that. Adding a few more darks along the horizon there as well. With thick, creamy paint, you can use freshly squeezed tube paint. I'm using Daniel Smith's hand-poured paints, which are lovely and creamy as well. So just adding a few darks and reflections and markings, and just, it's quite abstract. It's completely out of my imagination. I'm painting in some reflections as well and adding more information to the jetty there. Rinsing my brush, I took the excess water off and I'm just lifting off some of the darks there, and then adding a few more sort of warmer marks, reflections, damp into damp. I haven't dried the painting at all. I'm just having some fun adding these elongated reflections using the burnt umber and a pinch of the maybe phthalo blue or ultramarine to make it a little bit darker. I'm almost finished this little mini painting just by adding these sort of darks now, damp into damp. You can wait for your painting to dry if you want to get sort of more hard, crisp edges, but it's quite nice painting the reflections using this technique. So I'm going to finish off with some highlights. So the painting has dried now and I'm just using white gouache. You can use white watercolor or even white acrylics, and just sort of painting wet on dry with this size 2 brush, and it's straight from the tube. A few little highlights here and there, even on the jetty and in the distance, maybe some lights, etc. I thought it'd be quite nice actually to mix up some of the Pyrrole red with the Hansa yellow deep to add some sort of orangey and red lights in the distance. It can draw your eye in. So here's a close-up here, and I'm using some of that colourful reflections as well. So from quite a cool sort of painting, I'm adding this colour almost like a focal point. So the light could be like a focal point. So adding a little bit more of the red and yellow mixed for some elongated reflections, wet on dry with the size 2 brush, and just finishing off adding a little bit more light there on the horizon here and there. So there's no drawing here. I'm just wetting the sky area with my size 8 brush here down to a low horizon, using the plastic cards with a mixture of ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna and a pinch of the phthalo blue, and it's quite thick and creamy, and just applying that there at the horizon line where it is dry just below, but where it's wet you can see the paint sort of flowing up. And I'm just painting imaginary buildings with the plastic card, printing with the card there, and you can see the individual colours sort of blending on the paper, and just using the edge of the card just to print a little bit more. Now using a clean damp brush just to wet the bottom part and catch that paint there and draw it down. There you can see how it's flowing down now nicely, and just using a clean damp brush just to make the bottom part lighter and make sure there's no hard edges. So I'm using ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna, quite pale, and painting the sky wet into wet with my size 8 brush. Mixing up a little bit more ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna, slightly darker, slightly creamier, painting damp into wet, leaving gaps for the clouds there as well, painting just below using the tip of my brush, painting wet into wet there. Mixing a little bit more ultramarine with the burnt sienna and painting the water at the bottom damp into damp, blending there. A little bit more ultramarine, making it slightly darker, painting the top of the sky wet into wet there. A little bit more sort of blue grey just to build up the top of the sky to create depth really. The top of the sky will be darker because it's nearest to us. Adding a little bit more detail there in the middle of the sky, wet into wet, using the tip of my brush. Still using predominantly ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna to make that blue grey. So on to the next two paintings. I'll be painting them together. So it's not quite a triptych, I'm not quite sure what the word is for it, but I'm just wetting the sky area down to the horizon with my size 8 brush using clean water. So make sure you spend time doing that, it gives you more time. I'm using the plastic card directly into the paint here, using Cobalt Turquoise, a little bit of burnt sienna and Phthalo blue, and just applying it here, sort of damp into wet. Just seeing what happens. There's a lot of burnt sienna that's come out there. What I really like about these Daniel Smith semi-moist paints is that they are really kind of moist, even though they're pans, but you can squeeze out tube paint for this as well. And if you are using pans, just give them a spritz about half an hour before you use them to make them a little bit more moist. So I'm just literally printing here using quite pale sort of ultramarine with burnt sienna mixed, going back into phthalo blue, really scraping off lots of colour there and applying this thick paint here, damp into damp there, printing. As you can see, I've got some dark marks there and just creating the look of buildings by swiping. Just adding a few more, and you can see you've got the different colours on the card as well, and I'm just so fascinated by this technique. I just love it. So I'm just going along, just printing away, creating smaller buildings, taller buildings, really varying the sizes as well. Remember, you can use your own colour variations, pulling some of that paint down onto the dry surface there. I've decided to tilt and spritz. I'm aiming at the water's edge there, trying to miss the buildings and allowing the paint to run down. Going back in with small paint with my plastic card. Remember, I've almost cut it to the size of the pan so I can swipe off. And I'm just sort of using the corner of the card to print in some windows. You can wait for your painting to dry to do this, but it's pretty much dried off now, the top part of the painting. So they look like lots of sort of skyscrapers with windows. So just applying a little bit more dark there, sort of in front of the buildings, and again swiping left and right to create the look of the taller buildings there. I'm mixing up a little bit of green here. You can actually mix up yellow and blue if you want to, mixing a little bit of Cobalt Turquoise in there as well. And I'm actually sort of painting wet into wet the bottom part of the water there, adding a little bit more of the blue. You can use a little bit of ultramarine just to grey it down. I'm just experimenting, trying out different colours. And I'm painting the sky wet in wet as well, and just using a very sort of greyed down ultramarine with a tiny pinch of burnt sienna. I think a little bit of that green has crept in there as well. And just finishing off at the bottom here with a little bit of darker ultramarine, wet in wet, at the top of the sky there as well, wet in wet with my size 8 brush. So I'm wetting the sky with my size 8 mop brush. Give it a good soak, starting off with some Hansa yellow light and buff titanium. And I'm going to paint the sky wet into wet here with the size 8 brush. It's so lovely working on a small scale here, but also going across 3 little mini paintings. It's so freeing up. So I'm mixing up here a little bit of Quinacridone burnt orange. You can use burnt sienna with a little bit of raw umber. You can use burnt umber. and a little bit of the Jane's grey. You can use Paynes grey, and I'm just painting sort of damp into wet, some darker clouds there. A little bit more ultramarine, damp into damp, and a little bit more of that raw umber. Again, you can use burnt umber. I'm just literally dipping my brush into some of these delicious colours. A pinch of the Alizarin crimson there, and a little bit more of the burnt umber and raw umber. Because these colours are very semi-moist, you can really pick up the colour. So I'm just playing with them, really mixing up all these rich browns. I want the colours in the sky to be sort of golden dark browns, and a great contrast to that lovely sort of yellow sky there. So you've got a real sort of light against dark. So adding a little bit of Pyrrole red with the brown, damp into damp along the horizon, a little bit more of the raw umber. Again, you can use burnt umber. And just painting damp into damp down to the horizon line. There we are. So you can see how that lovely yellow cloud looks so sort of dramatic and atmospheric. Tilting here, adding a little bit of ultramarine, damp into damp, again to create some dramatic dark clouds there against the light of the sky. Damp into damp right down to the horizon, still tilting. Just seeing what happens, and again experimenting, painting damp into damp here, top right hand corner, building up the darks there while the paint is still damp, tilting to the right to get it moving, to get it blending, to make it look atmospheric and more natural looking. So going to mix up a little bit of the buff titanium. I'm painting wet on dry with the yellow, with a pinch of Quinacridone gold, wet into wet, painting up to that horizon, catching the horizon there, but leaving some white as well to create that sort of dramatic light and sparkle, still using that size 8 brush. Mixing up some burnt umber, painting damp into wet there, a little bit more raw umber, it's slightly sort of darker, and a little bit of the grey as well, damp into damp just in the foreground to create some lovely darks there, again creating contrast with that light in the sand area. A little bit of phthalo blue, burnt sienna there. I'm really going for it for all these lovely warm colours. Bit of the Jane's grey right at the bottom there. You could mix ultramarine with burnt sienna. Just experiment and have a play. Bit of phthalo blue here. I've swapped to my size 4 round brush. A little bit more of that grey, swiping across, damp into damp across that sandy beach there. But it almost creates a dry brush effect because my brush has hardly any water, it's mostly pigment. You get a little bit of texture there. As you can see, there's got a lot of drama, the light in the sky and the light on the sand. So I'm tilting here just to soften some of those darks. I felt I need a little bit more light, so I'm spritzing here, the middle little painting and the one on the right there, and letting the sky run down as well, and then wiping off with my paper towel there to maintain control. You don't want that great big puddle of water to run back into your painting. So what I'm doing now is I am mixing up again that Quinacridone burnt orange and a little bit of the grey, and I'm painting on the horizon there, damp into damp with my size 4 brush. You can use ultramarine and burnt umber or burnt sienna to get this lovely warm dark. So I want to create some distance here, but I want to come away from the sky. So I'm just adding some of that grey there, damp into damp. It bleeds slightly, but it makes it look more natural, especially in the middle there. Painting on the left here as well, some smaller marks just to look like land in the distance there, using my size 4 round brush. It's quite nice using this sort of family of warm, sort of light, mid and dark colours here, just to get everything looking quite harmonious in the painting. So I'm going to paint a little bit more sort of dark here on the right hand side, almost abstracted marks. And I'm going to paint the people damp into damp. Now, if you're worried about it bleeding too much, let your painting dry and then you can paint these people wet on dry. I'll put a link in the description below of my little people painting tutorial to help you paint little people. But I'm painting damp into damp using the grey with some burnt umber, size 4 brush, some very small heads, and literally a very small arch window for the body and a line, a long thin line for the legs. And I've actually given this little person a little dog as well. It can just be a very small mark, and I've painted some reflections to really ground them on the beach so they don't look like they're floating. I'm mixing up some of the grey here with the phthalo blue, really creamy paint, painting damp into damp, almost damp on dry, and just painting a very small head, the body, literally a thin line for the legs. And I've decided to give this person a friend, a companion. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, small head, arch window for the body, and I put 2 thin lines for the legs. I've given them a little dog, which is just a little sort of round sort of splodge really, and some reflection again to ground them so they don't look like they're floating. So here is a close-up here of all the tutorials. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and it inspires you to paint some mini paintings, especially if you are lacking in confidence in watercolour or you don't have the time. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. If you would like to support the content that I create here on YouTube and get access to my exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Just click the word Patreon in the description below. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.